headlines for this week of December 18th. Climate fraud in the aftermath of so-called historic agreement. Sources are now saying it was all meaningless. Humiliation complete. U.S. government forced to continue backtracking on Syria as evidence continues to mount on its involvement in crimes. Failure to notice. World Muslim community condemns Daesh, yet media oblivious to their voice. And bonds to bust. Latest phase of financial transformation sees 3 junk bond dealers crash and burn.
With news around, upon, within, and beyond our planet, the program making disclosure official. This is Cosmic Vision News. Here is Jeffrey West.
Greetings and blessings to all. In the follow-up to the Paris climate talks, now that there has been time for participants and the general population to take in the deal that saw a landmark agreement approved by numerous nations around the world, other sources are beginning to comment on what may be a more realistic assessment of the agreement. CVN reported on some of the events last week. It could be argued that the North American media was more interested in covering the antics of Donald Trump than they were in covering events leading up to and including the landmark deal that was presented to the world. Considering that it is this planet that keeps humanity alive, one might think that this would be a significant event. But in a world where corporate interests and a global banking cabal have enslaved humanity and destroyed the planet for profit, power, and greed, this would not seem to be the case. This is not to sound pessimistic, however. Events that are happening in the world at this time, at least some of them, may give one the impression that only bad things are happening and that there is little hope for the future. This is not the case, and if one knows where to look for relevant information, one may begin to understand that within the revelations of truth, there will also be a lot of smoke and mirrors to distract those who are unable or unwilling to read between the lines. The New York Times reported the following last week. 195 nations reached a landmark accord that will, for the first time, commit nearly every country to lowering planet-warming greenhouse gas emissions to help stave off the most drastic effects of climate change. Traditionally, such pacts have required developed economies, like the United States, to take action to lower greenhouse gas emissions, but they have exempted developing countries like China and India from such obligations. The accord, which United Nations diplomats have been working toward for 9 years, changes that dynamic by requiring action in some form from every country, rich or poor. Scientists and leaders said the talks here represented the world's last best hope of striking a deal that would begin to avert the most devastating effects of a warming planet. The article continues, just 5 years ago, such a deal seemed politically impossible. A similar 2009 climate change summit meeting in Copenhagen collapsed in acrimonious failure after countries could not unite around a deal. Unlike in Copenhagen, Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius of France said on Saturday, the stars for this assembly were aligned. The article's author and perhaps Laurent Fabius both probably had no idea just how literally correct that last statement may well have been. Part of what makes agreements like these meaningless is because corporate and political leaders are unwilling to change the dynamics of the geo-economic structure to accompany the changes being celebrated in this agreement. As long as corporate interests are still tied directly to profits, and as long as politicians are still focused on self-interests as opposed to planetary and humanity interests, the agreement, however wonderful, is not going to achieve what is being trumpeted to the world. We have seen failure after failure of numerous documents, treaties, declarations, and statements as they are initially presented to the world with fanfare, only to be packed away in a box while corporate and government lawyers circumvent the legal processes and take advantage of the loopholes to allow their interests to keep on making their profits and to keep certain people in power, while humanity and the planet continue to suffer. A London Guardian article on December the 12th by Oliver Millman reported on James Hansen, a former NASA scientist, and one who is considered to be a father of climate change awareness, as he gave his assessment of the talks. Millman quotes Hansen as saying that it's a fraud, really a fake. It's just bullshit for them to say, we'll have a 2 degrees Celsius warming target and then try to do a little better every 5 years. It's just worthless words. There is no action, just promises. As long as fossil fuels appear to be the cheapest fuels out there, they will be continued to be burned. The article continues. Hansen has just returned from Paris, where he again called for a price to be placed on each ton of carbon from major emitters. He suggested a fee because taxes scare people off. Perhaps of $15 a ton, and that would rise $10 a year and bring in $600 billion in the U.S. alone. There aren't many takers, even among big green, as Hansen labels environment groups. Hansen has been a nagging yet respected voice on climate change since he shot to prominence in the summer of 1988. The NASA scientist, who had been analyzing changes in the Earth's climate since the 70s, told a congressional committee that something called the greenhouse effect, where heat-trapped gases are released into the atmosphere, was causing global warming with a 99% certainty. Although Hansen may be offering some truth about the end goal, increasing evidence seems to suggest that this may not be the reason at all for the warming, but it may be an elaborate ruse to scare humanity and pump them for more money to fight something that may not be there at all, but is rather a shift of a larger nature involving our entire solar system. And there are people seeking to cash in on this. Jeremy Roos, writing for Roar magazine on December 14th, offered his 3 reasons why the climate deal is a fraud. He writes that world leaders and the international media are hailing the deal struck in Paris as a major leap for mankind in the fight against climate change. But there are many reasons to remain deeply skeptical. 3 stand out in particular. Roos writes the following. Number 1, to begin with, the climate deal contains a lot of pretty words, but no commitments to concrete actions. Nowhere in the agreement do governments stipulate the steps they will take to meet their ambitious target of keeping global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This target can only be met if 90% of the world's remaining fossil fuels are kept in the ground. By mid-century, the 195 signatories would need to have achieved a near-complete decarbonization of the world economy. This would, in turn, require a rapid and wholesale shift away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy sources. Yet the agreement does not contain any concrete roadmap on how to bring about such a radical transformation. The words fossil fuels, oil, or coal are not even mentioned in the text. Number 2, Roos writes, the numbers don't add up. Even if all individual pledges in the intended, nationally determined contributions are met, the world would still be on course for an average global temperature increase of at least 2.7 degrees, an amount widely considered by scientists to bring about a catastrophic destabilization of the global climate and planetary life support systems. As Miles Allen, professor of geosystem science at Oxford University, notes, human-induced warming is already approaching 1 degree and is predicted to be at 1.2 degrees Celsius by 2030, so 1.5 degrees Celsius will be a challenge. To meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, a tremendous amount of resources would have to be made available, both to fundamentally transform energy, transport, and agricultural systems in the advanced economies and to help the poorer countries leapfrog the transition to a post-carbon renewable energy future. Number 3, corporate power remains unchecked. The article writes, preventing catastrophic climate change is impossible without keeping the vast majority of known fossil fuel reserves in the ground. And any attempt to keep fossil fuels in the ground will inevitably involve a head-on confrontation with the fossil fuel industry, whose extractive business model would be completely destroyed by any meaningful transition towards a post-carbon economy. Ruse closes with the following observation. This climate deal has the mark of the fossil fuel industry stamped all over it. By failing to commit to concrete actions and a clear enforceable roadmap, by fudging the numbers and not committing sufficient resources to an immediate and wholesale energy transformation, and by systematically refusing to tax carbon and take on the immense power of the fossil fuel industry, world leaders have signed an accord they clearly cannot keep. It is all part of the game that is unfolding at this time, partly a strategy by the global cabal to keep humanity in debt, fear, illness, and separation, partly a strategy by those trying to legitimately and honorably change by offering hope wherever they can without revealing too much of their agenda, without being cut off by the global cabal, and partly a strategy of forces currently beyond the general knowledge of the human population that are operating in ways that are not being revealed at this time to help eliminate the threat of this global cabal. Observe what is unfolding without judgment, and if you are called upon to offer comments on this subject, you can invite others to consider the possibility that something much bigger is unfolding and all the pieces and players have not yet been fully revealed. The Western media have been negligent, and arguably criminally negligent, in not exposing the lies, frauds, and crimes of those who are controlling and profiting from this charade. The will of the people are speaking, however, and it is empowering certain other individuals to come forward to serve and answer a higher calling at this time. In other geopolitical news, there are many who say great and positive changes are now underway in more ways than can possibly be explained to the mainstream general public. There are those who argue we are on the verge of world war, and there are those who still choose to defend, even violently, certain beliefs that have been revealed to be no longer accurate. Each soul is allowed his or her space to accept whatever that one person chooses to accept as truth, and it is not for me or any one of us to judge another on his or her spiritual growth. Each will receive the right message at the right time from the appropriate source when the individual is ready to receive it. It is only up to each of us to continue to stand strong in our own truth while observing all that is coming up for healing, not only on the planet, but within each one of us also, and while also gently empowering others to seek out information that they are ready to receive to help them understand all that is now going on. There is none among us who has the whole global or even cosmic picture, and no one can presume to know the life path and lessons that another has come here to learn and participate in. As challenging as it is for more of the awakened souls among us, we have to observe and allow others to follow their truths until that truth no longer has meaning for them. It comes down to discernment, as has been said countless times on this broadcast. There are mixed signals everywhere. The Western media tries to sell a particular message to Western audiences that Daesh, the Islamic State, is a Muslim group. Yet, a Chicago Post article from early November reported the following. A revealing light on how we got here has now been shone by a recently declassified secret U.S. intelligence report. The link will be in the show summary, written in August of 2012, which uncannily predicts and effectively welcomes the prospect of a Salafist principality in eastern Syria and an al-Qaeda-controlled Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. In stark contrast to Western claims at the time, the Defense Intelligence Agency document identifies al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became ISIS or Daesh, and fellow Salafists as the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria, and states that Western countries, the Gulf states, and Turkey were supporting the opposition's efforts to take control of eastern Syria. What's clear is that ISIS and its monstrosities won't be defeated by the same powers that brought it to Iraq and Syria in the first place, or whose open and covert war-making has fostered it in the years since. Endless Western military interventions in the Middle East have brought only destruction and division. It's the people of the region who can cure this disease, not those who incubated the virus. For almost 2 years, Russia has been demonized by Western countries for its alleged actions against Ukraine, despite the evidence to show that the U.S. and other Western players orchestrated the events in that country and installed their own puppet government. Russia has been punished with sanctions, and the Western media have attempted to paint Russia as being responsible for other activities when evidence is increasingly supporting the opposite. Russia has been providing evidence backed up with satellite photos, and the government appears, at this time, to have been following the appropriate diplomatic protocols in informing both U.S. and Israel about their intentions to take out Daesh in Syria. Why was Russia informing a small country like Israel? Very likely because Russia knows and understands fully Israel's involvement in all this, and this was being made known to the Israelis. Then there is the alleged U.S. campaign to remove the Islamic State from Syria, a country in which they have never received any permission or invitation to enter. Despite being, allegedly, the world's most advanced military, and despite the boasting that the U.S. intelligence agencies are the most efficient and highly trained in the world, it seems nothing could be further from the truth. The only times these organizations are effective is when it comes to dealing with people who oppose or challenge U.S.-Israeli hegemony. And even Russia is now proving that they are incapable of even doing this. Rudy Pankow, writing for Russia Insider on December the 14th, reported the following. American officials and responsible Western news pundits have had a hard time explaining why the U.S.-led, quote-unquote, anti-ISIS coalition, after more than 1 year, has been unable to stop ISIS's lucrative oil smuggling operation. Reports from pilots and sources up and down the Pentagon chain of command tell an interesting story. Considering America's years of experience at precision bombing and the vast intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities of the world's largest military, America's utter failure in curtailing ISIS and her dozens of sister organizations has been inexplicable. American pilots flying over Iraq and Syria have quietly leaked their story for over a year now, but no news agency will carry it. They say they have flown over oil tanker convoys, 4 lanes wide at times, and have been told to stay silent. They report mysterious aircraft dropping supplies to ISIS and al-Nusra. They are silenced on that as well. The evidence has been coming out that Daesh is trained by the U.S. and Israel. Evidence is out that Turkey has been stealing and transporting Daesh oil through its territory to ports and sold for outrageous profits to fund its organization. The U.S. is complicit in the crime by not striking oil convoys going to or through Turkey. Numerous countries have been benefiting from cheaper, stolen oil from Syria, Iraq, and likely other countries because of Daesh. RT reported on December 15th that Ankara and Washington contravened the UN resolution on financing terrorism, by failing to inform the Security Council about Islamic State illegally trafficking stolen oil, Russia's UN envoy has said. Vitaly Churkin was quoted as saying that we've got serious complaints about the implementation of UN Resolution 2199, the banning financing of the terrorist organizations. Under Resolution 2199, adopted on our initiative in February, countries are obliged to provide information about financing terrorists to the Security Council if they have such information. That means the Americans had to provide such information, and of course Turkey, which should have reported any illegal oil trade going on there. They didn't do it. Last week, the Russian Defense Ministry presented evidence showing that oil was being transported by Daesh via Turkey, despite U.S. intelligence claims that the quantity of oil being delivered was, quote-unquote, insignificant. What remains confusing to most is that there is a shadow government in the United States, and it could be argued that numerous other countries are governed by shadow governments connected to the same group within the global cabal. We are witnessing actions taking place on attempting to remove the cabal, and then we are witnessing actions related to keeping the geopolitical situation in a somewhat familiar position that will not cause global panic among those who do not understand what is going on. The tables are being turned on the U.S. and its foreign policy position. Despite the attempts of the U.S. to isolate Russia, it is, in fact, the U.S. that has been doing all the backtracking on its glorified barking with no biting. A Zero Hedge article notes the following. The U.S.-backed effort to assist Qatar and the Saudis in destabilizing the Assad regime in Syria was doomed from the start. It was about a month later, the Zero Hedge article cites another article appearing on the Wall Street Journal as stating, the Obama administration entered a crucial round of international talks on Syria's war, prepared to accept a deal that leaves President Bashar al-Assad in place for several months or more during the transition to a new government. The U.S. shift on the dictators or alleged dictators' future caps months of backtracking on the most significant obstacle to a resolution of the Syrian conflict. The Zero Hedge article continues. On December 15th, Kerry, U.S. Secretary of State Kerry, was in Russia for talks with Vladimir Putin. As for negotiations with Putin over Syria, it appears the humiliation is now complete. As the Associated Press reports, Kerry on Tuesday accepted Russia's long-standing demand that President Assad's future be determined by his own people, as Washington and Moscow edged toward putting aside years of disagreement over how to end Syria's civil war. The United States and our partners are not seeking so-called regime change, Kerry said, adding that the focus is no longer on our differences about what can or cannot be done immediately about Assad. Fox News reported the same information on the 15th, but added that Kerry said a major international conference on Syria would take place later this week in New York. That meeting was underway as this newscast is being prepared, and in late developments on December the 18th, RT reported that the UN Security Council, the UNSC, has unanimously adopted a resolution calling for a ceasefire and political settlement in Syria. The resolution envisions the formation of a unity government and calls for an immediate halt to any attacks on civilian targets. The resolution demands that all parties to the Syrian conflict immediately cease any attacks against civilians. A mechanism to monitor, verify, and report on the truce is to be worked out within a month. Now, what seems particularly odd about this resolution is that one group, the one group that has been responsible for all of the problems, Daesh or Islamic State or al-Nusra, has been excluded from the ceasefire, according to RT. There are 5 permanent members to the UN Security Council: China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. These countries have the power to veto any resolutions. There are 10 other non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms. Based on what appears to be happening right now, France appears to be moving closer to Russia and likely also to China. The UK still seems to be aligning with the US. NATO is continuing its process of fracturing and at any point during the coming year could very well break up. Russia knows that the US and Israel are involved, but if they tried to enforce this ceasefire on Daesh, the US and possibly the UK would probably veto it. If Daesh was allowed to continue its actions, Russia should have vetoed it, but they did not. This is where grand diplomatic strategy comes into play, and at this moment, it appears Russia is playing it well. They needed to get the UN Security Council to recognize and acknowledge what is going on. Resolutions by the Security Council are legally binding if they are made under Chapter 7 of the Charter, relating to action with respect to threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. Russia is already in the process of taking out ISIS, so they don't necessarily need to worry about this particular agreement, it would seem. Is the Middle East safer without the alleged dictators that the U.S. claimed had to be removed because of the alleged threats they represented to world peace? We finish off this story with a report from Ben Swan.
The Middle East was better off with Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi in power. Those words from Republican presidential candidate and Texas Senator Ted Cruz. But is he right? What do the numbers show in the years since the Iraq War?
We've seen a consistent mistake in foreign policy. It's far too often. We've seen Democrats and a lot of establishment Republicans in Washington get involved in toppling Middle Eastern governments.
Right.
And it ends up benefiting the bad guys. It ends up handing them over to radical Islamic terror.
That was Texas Senator Ted Cruz on MSNBC's Morning Joe. The senator explaining how he believes American intervention since the start of the Iraq War has led from one disaster to another.
Was the world, in fact, in the Middle East a more secure place when Saddam Hussein was in power, when Muammar Gaddafi was in power, and when Assad wasn't fighting for his life in Syria?
Of course it was.
It's more stable.
That's not even a close call.
Well, without question, the senator is correct. The Middle East was without question safer and more secure under Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, and when Assad wasn't fighting for his life. But to really get that point, here's some numbers to consider. According to reports from our own U.S. government, reports of deaths from terrorism in the Middle East between 2002 and 2014 have increased 4,500%. But let's go a little bit deeper here. Take, for instance, just the country of Iraq. Before the 2003 U.S. invasion, do you know how many suicide attacks there were in Iraq? None. In the country's history, there had never been one. But since the 2003 invasion, there have been 1,892. In Iraq, prior to the start of the Iraq War, there were reportedly just over 1.5 million Christians living in that country. 1.5 million. And yet shortly after the war started, over 1 million of them fled to Syria. That didn't work out well there, certainly. And today, fewer than 500,000 Christians remain, and yet are being exterminated by groups like ISIS. And what about Afghanistan? Just last year alone, insurgents killed 2,643 civilians, the highest number since the UN began keeping records. How about Pakistan? In the 14 years prior to 9/11, get this, there was only one suicide attack on Pakistani soil. In the 14 years since, 486 suicide attacks. The same is true in the past 14 years in Somalia, 88, Yemen, 85, Libya, 29, Nigeria, 91, and in Syria, 165. So what you need to know is that 14 years after this so-called war on terror began, the United States is on track to have spent $6 trillion on just the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Putting that into perspective, that means that we have spent $75,000 per American household, most of it borrowed money. What's more, nearly 7,000 U.S. military personnel have died. Tens of thousands more are being lost every day as 22 U.S. veterans commit suicide each day. If we're to be honest here, the only thing that the war on terror seems to have brought us and the rest of the world is more war and more terror. That's Reality Check.
Things are becoming very interesting and also very public. The wish of many people for a long time, myself included. The pieces are slowly falling into place. Various developments have been taking place over the last week relating to the actions of Daesh, also known as the Islamic State. CVN is going to be stopping its use of the terms Islamic State or ISIS or ISIL because the group has been revealed now to not be made of radical Islamic individuals, as we are being led to believe by various governments and media. CVN suggests to listeners to avoid using terms that make any reference to Islam when sharing information about this group. This group is nothing but a proxy army of mercenaries hired and trained through the U.S. and Israel. Case in point. An article appearing on the London Independent website on December 9th by Serena Sandhu covers a Muslim anti-ISIS protest that took place in that city, and the media did not give it attention. She writes, organizers of an anti-ISIS march in London have spoken of their frustration after mainstream media outlets failed to cover the demonstration. Thousands of people took part in the annual UK Arba'een procession coordinated by the Husseini Islamic Trust UK on Sunday. Although Shia Muslims take part in the march each year to mark the Arba'een, or mourning, the anniversary of Imam Hussein, a 7th century leader who fought for social justice, this year organizers decided to use the event as a platform to denounce terrorism following the recent ISIS attacks in Paris, Beirut, and elsewhere. Organizer Waqar Haider said, "This year we had hundreds of placards which were basically saying no to terrorism and no to ISIS. A very direct message. For us, it was a controversial move to go political. Normally, we don't mix politics with mourning. However, with what's happened recently, we thought we had to make sure we as a community totally disassociate ourselves with what's happening elsewhere in the world." In another article on the forwardprogressives.com website on December the 10th, Manny Schuetz writes that every year in northern India, Muslims gather in Ajmer for the Urj festival to remember the death of Moinuddin Chishti, a Sufi Islamic cleric and scholar. This year, around 70,000 clerics who attended issued a fatwa condemning terrorism, but you'll never hear about this from the conservative media or politicians who are trying to whip up hatred toward Muslims. For the benefit of those who do not know, a fatwa is an Islamic legal pronouncement issued by an expert in religious law, mufti, pertaining to a specific issue, usually at the request of an individual or judge to resolve an issue where Islamic jurisprudence is unclear. The Times of India was referenced in the article, reporting that Hazrat Subhan Razan Khan, chairperson of the influential Dargah Ala Hazrat, said that following the Paris attacks, it was decided that a fatwa should be passed at the Urs this year. So the message went out loudly and clearly that the Muslim community condemns terrorism. The author offers that he himself is an atheist, but writes that I'm not sure what it will take for Islamophobes around the world to understand that the Muslim community as a whole is not responsible for the acts of terrorism committed by individuals who claim to follow Islam. The overwhelming majority of Muslims today reject ISIS and various terrorist groups. The irony, as most listeners will already know, is that a significant number of conflicts worldwide have been fought in the name of religion, when it is really only about bankers stirring up conflicts for profit. Religious messages of all faiths have been equally corrupted for the purposes of controlling and stealing from their respective members. Again, with gratitude to the tens or perhaps hundreds of thousands of souls awakening worldwide, the movement is on to expose this fraud for what it is and those who have been capitalizing on it in the most dishonorable of ways. In financial news, it would seem that the world has now begun its slide into the end game of the old financial paradigm, although North American business pundits are either knowingly trying to deceive the public on this, or they themselves are naively ignorant of the game to which they are being recognized as so-called experts. This week, Michael Snyder, writing for ActivistPost.com, noted that we are in the midst of a financial crisis. I personally would prefer to position this as a financial transformation, but again, this depends upon the perspective one is listening to, and discernment is again of vital importance. Snyder writes, just within the past few days, 3 major high-yield funds have completely imploded, and panic is spreading rapidly on Wall Street. Funds run by Third Avenue Management and Stone Lion Capital Partners have suspended payments to investors, and a fund run by Lucidus Capital Partners has liquidated its entire portfolio. We are witnessing a race for the exits, unlike anything we have seen since the great financial crash of 2008, and many of those that choose to hesitate are going to end up getting totally wiped out. In case you are wondering, this is what a financial crisis looks like. In 2008, other global stock markets started to tumble, then junk bonds began to crash, and finally U.S. stocks followed. The exact same pattern is playing out again, and the carnage that we have seen so far is just the tip of the iceberg. The article adds that Scott Minerd, Global Chief Investment Officer at Guggenheim Partners, predicts 10% to 15% of junk bond funds may face high withdrawals as more investors worry about getting their money back. He joins money managers Jeffrey Gundlach, Carl Icahn, Bill Gross, and Wilbur Ross in warning of more high-yield trouble ahead. In this type of environment, the Federal Reserve would have to be completely insane to raise interest rates. Well, the Fed did exactly that earlier this week, and Snyder writes that higher rates could make corporate bond defaults more likely, and investors are already bailing out of the sector, pulling $3.8 billion out of high-yield funds in the week ended December 9th, the biggest move in 15 weeks. The effective yield on U.S. junk bonds is now 17%, the highest level in 5 years, according to Bank of America Merrill Lynch data. The article is written for those who are still trapped within the old financial paradigm, and the article attempts to offer its advice on how to survive the author's so-called crisis. The article seems to suggest that he has no knowledge of what is unfolding on the higher levels, although perhaps this remains to be seen. A CNN article reported that Third Avenue responded to the criticism on Monday by announcing longtime CEO David Barse as having resigned. The firm said it will now be led by a team of executives. Links to several other articles relating to this story will appear in the show summary. As we heard last week, the current financial paradigm is criminally corrupt and on the verge of a major transformation. Some people may use the word collapse, although this word tends to cause too much fear. Only those who have stolen from others and who have a significant amount to lose might have a reason to be fearful. William Engdahl, in 2 separate articles, explores Russia's move away from the U.S. dollar, but also the birthing of the gold-backed Russian ruble and Chinese renminbi. Engdahl's first article on December the 5th, reprinted in Sputnik News, writes the following. A gold-backed ruble and gold-backed yuan could start a snowball exit from the dollar. F. William Engdahl notes, adding that it will diminish America's ability to use the reserve dollar role to finance Washington's perpetual overseas wars. The irony of the situation is that the central banks of China, Russia, Brazil, and other countries, diametrically opposed to U.S. foreign policy course, are forced to stockpile dollars in the form of, quote-unquote, safe U.S. Treasury debt, in order to protect their economies. Engdahl mentions that the deals that CVN reported on last year between Russia and China and how they are no longer using the U.S. dollar as a median currency. Engdahl notes Russia's inclusion of the Chinese renminbi in its official reserves also. According to Engdahl, there are clear signs showing that gold is about to make a dramatic return to the world monetary stage, and it is not necessarily good news for the U.S. Russia and China are decisively paving the way for the world economy de-dollarization. Engdahl closes this article with the following. A Russian-Chinese alternative to the dollar in the form of a gold-backed ruble and gold-backed renminbi or yuan could start a snowball exit from the U.S. dollar and with it a severe decline in America's ability to use the reserve dollar to finance her wars with other people's money. In his second article on December the 12th, he explores Russia's latest step in moving away from the dollar, and he writes the following. Gold is about to make a dramatic return to the world monetary stage for the first time since Washington unilaterally ripped up the Bretton Woods Treaty in August of 1971. At that point, advised by David Rockefeller's personal emissary in the Treasury, Paul Volcker, President Nixon announced Washington was refusing to honor its treaty obligations to redeem the dollars held abroad for U.S. central bank gold. Since that time, rumors have persisted that, in fact, the gold chambers of Fort Knox are bare, a fact that, were it to be verified, would spell curtains for the dollar as reserve currency. Washington adamantly holds to the storyline that the Federal Reserve sits on 8,133 tons of gold reserves. If true, that would far exceed the second largest, Germany, whose official gold holdings are listed by the IMF at 3,381 tons. In 2014, a bizarre event transpired which fed the doubts about U.S. official gold statistics. In 2012, the German government asked the Federal Reserve to return German central bank gold held in custody for the Bundesbank by the Fed. Shocking the world, the U.S. central bank refused to give Germany her gold back, using the flimsy excuse that the Federal Reserve could not differentiate German gold bars from U.S. ones. The U.S. did end up repatriating a small 5 tons of gold, of that amount rather, and as a result of that scandal. And there's more, and Engdahl continues. Into this dynamic, the Central Bank of Russia has been adding to its official gold reserves in dramatic fashion in recent years. Since the growing hostility with Washington, the pace has become far more rapid. From January 2013, Russia's official gold has expanded by 129% to 1,352 tons as of September 30th, 2015. In 2000, at the end of the decade of U.S.-backed plunder of the Russian Federation during the dark Yeltsin years of the 90s, Russia's gold reserves stood at 343 tons. The vaults of the Russian Central Bank, which at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 held some 2,000 tons of official gold, had been stripped during the controversial tenure of Gosbank head Viktor Gerashenko, who told a startled Duma that he could not account for the whereabouts of the Russian gold. It is believed that the U.S. has also taken the gold from the vaults of the Ukraine government also, and allegedly confiscated, and that was confiscated by the New York Fed Reserve, as reported by Professor Michel Chossudovsky in a Global Research article from March 14th of 2014. All of this is connected to the political events mentioned in the previous stories. In last week's newscast, I began looking at a series of articles about the fractional reserve banking system by Jeff Nielsen. Unfortunately, as I am already running late to get the newscast to air, I'm going to have to skip over this story. Perhaps in the next newscast I will be able to continue with this investigation. In general news, one of the promises made by the incoming Liberal government in Canada was to address issues relating to the Indigenous tribes or Indigenous bands of Canada. Shortly after his election, Justin Trudeau appeared to make good on his promise to address the issue of missing Indigenous women. The action, however, did not appear to address the issue of missing Indigenous children from residential schools that were set up in Canada. CVN reported earlier this year the results of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was set up by the former Harper government. It is perhaps not much of a surprise that this report got buried under the weight of other geopolitical events. No doubt, part of Harper's attempt to avoid having to address the results of this commission. The Government of Canada appears to have taken another step forward in its attempts to address long overdue grievances relating to the Indigenous people of Canada. An article from the CBC back in 2008 quoted former Prime Minister Harper as saying the following: "The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. Today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. The government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative, and that this policy has had a lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language." Harper's so-called apology appears to have had no meaning, however, because the Aboriginal People's TV network reported on December 15th that the previous Conservative government of Stephen Harper stymied the search for children who died throughout the over century-long existence of Indian residential schools, according to the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This past week, the final report of the Commission was released and presented to Prime Minister Trudeau. A statement from the Prime Minister's office commented on the release of the report, stating that at the closing event in June of 2015, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, released its executive summary, which included its findings and 94 calls to action aimed at redressing the legacy of residential schools and advancing the process of reconciliation in Canada. During the TRC's presentation of its final report on December 15, 2015, the Prime Minister reiterated the Government of Canada's commitment to work in partnership with Indigenous communities, the provinces, territories, and other vital partners to fully implement recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, starting with the implementation of the UN Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In his own separate statement, Trudeau added that the meeting here today with the Assembly of First Nations, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, the Inuit Tapirit Kanatami, the Métis National Council, and the Native Women's Association of Canada is an important step towards realizing a renewed partnership. The views of these organizations are critical on how we engage on a number of the commitments we made to Indigenous peoples. We will be seeking views on the way forward for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, a national reconciliation framework informed by the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, starting with the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the funding and fiscal relationship required to close the gap in education and economic outcomes. A strong, healthy, cooperative relationship with the leaders of national Aboriginal organizations is key to making change happen. That is why I am committed to meeting annually with Indigenous leaders from across the country. It is important to remember one thing about all this. The Canadian government is a corporation, as is the Assembly of First Nations, the group that allegedly represents the interests of Indigenous people across the country. This group, however, represents only those nations that have sold or otherwise surrendered their individual rights to attain their corporate status within the Corporation of Canada. Regardless of how sincere Trudeau is in his apology, the issue of the corporate status of Canada's Indigenous nations needs to be addressed before any true reconciliation can take place. Indigenous is a word that, although not necessarily negative, may not fully describe the peoples who lived on the land of Turtle Island, now known as North America, before Canada and the United States came into being. The word to describe these peoples more accurately would be Lotinoshoni Unwe, and this means all natural people who belong to families organized according to the ancient ways. One nation, however, was not present at the events, and this was the Grand River Mohawk Nation, known by its true name, the Kanien'kehá:ka Onkwéonwe. Onkwéonwe is a Mohawk word that, according to Jason Bowman, simply means natural people. Longtime CVN listeners will know that I have been slowly revealing details of a story that has the potential to grow not only in complexity, but also in importance to Canada and to its Indigenous people and to governments worldwide. CVN spoke first with Jason Bowman, who has been commenting on issues relating to the Kanien'kehá:ka Onkwéonwe. He offers his insights on what the events that have taken place really mean and offers some hints as to what may be unfolding in the coming future.
Well, you know, Jeffrey, when I took part in a meeting with the now Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Dr. Carolyn Bennett, when she was an opposition MP, she invited Olele Goa, the Mohawk Wolf Clan chief, to send a delegation to meet with her at the House of Commons. And I took part in that delegation of Mohawks, and she assured us that Justin Trudeau would engage this file personally, and that it was atrocious what had happened. Things would be done differently if they formed the new government. And this government was elected in October, and we're getting close to Christmas, and neither this new minister nor Justin Trudeau nor indeed anyone will talk to the chief. And this, as a Canadian, so-called Canadian, I find it disgusting. And as somebody who has knowledge of the file, I find it reckless, and I don't understand how it's legal. These class actions that went on, one of them was started in 1998 by survivors of the Mohawk Institute Residential School, who attended between 1943 and 1967, I believe. And, compensation and damages sought in $900 million for breach of treaty rights, $150 million for punitive damages, $600 million compensation for breach of fiduciary duty, $600 million for further damages of loss of care, guidance, and companionship, and punitive and exemplary damages in the amount of $50 million. And there was a settlement, a massive settlement. But what did this actually mean for the survivors? Well, I'm going to tell you what it means. Students got $10,000 plus $3,000 for each year they attended, starting after their first year of attendance at a residential school. So if a student went to the Mohawk Residential School and was abused for 7 years, they'd receive $28,000. What an outrage. And what's even more outrageous is what the law firms collected on this scam. The Merchant Law Group billed they tried to get more, but they finally got $25 million. This is a group, a law firm from Saskatchewan. Then, a little while after they received the $25 million payment in 2008, the government of Canada took the law firm to school, claiming that lawyers were overbilling, such as 24 hours work in a single day. They backdated by years some entries, and the law firm claimed $80 million in fees and ended up getting 25. Just a disgusting disgrace. Apology? I'm not sure. Who got rich off of this? Some law firms. The dead and tortured children we never talk about. The abuse we haven't addressed. And it seems like this matter's all finished. I would beg to differ. Knowing what I know, there's got to be some arrests made, there's going to have to be some serious compensation paid out, and the criminal lawyers that are involved in maintaining this veil of secrecy ought to be held to account. Cohen Hiley, the firm in London that dealt with this one particular matter I was speaking about earlier, I already know that 2 of those lawyers had to stand trial, they actually escaped trial, but they had to answer to charges for fraud, title fraud, all sorts of different criminal offenses that the police wouldn't even prosecute, because I prosecuted them personally. And these are criminals, and of course they maintained their law licenses, continue to practice out of London, and go on to pull off these sorts of scams. I just find it a disgrace, and I think Mohawks of the Allies are going to be taking this matter into some serious courtroom very soon, and I look forward to that day.
Earlier today, I had the opportunity to speak with Bill Squire, a member of the Grand River Mohawk Wolf Clan, and he acts as a spokesperson for the Mohawk workers. He, along with Jason, serve in support of the office of Orerakoa, the Wolf Clan chief. CVN was unable to record the interview with Squire due to poor quality with the phone lines, but Squire shared the following information with CVN. The Assembly of First Nations falls under the Indian Act and applies to all Indigenous groups in Canada from the 1800s onward. The Mohawk Onkweonwe, however, are part of a different treaty that was dated 6 years prior to any Indian Act treaty that applies to Indigenous groups in Canada. This agreement, which has been referred to in the past as the Haldimand Treaty, is an agreement that comes directly from the monarchy, and thus the argument that the Mohawks are presenting is that they are not subject to the commercial agreements of the Indian Act because they have not surrendered to the Indian Act, nor are they subject to land abuses imposed upon them and their lands by corporate interests. The Mohawks are one of the few, if not the only Indigenous group in Canada to have a legitimate claim of sovereignty that the Government of Canada is not acknowledging, nor do they wish to acknowledge it, for it represents a potential significant shift, geographically, geopolitically, but also in terms of geoeconomics, for there is a claim to be settled that has not yet been addressed. The Government of Canada is seeking to group the Mohawks under the same legislation and commercial agreements as the other nations, even though the Mohawks can prove that they have a treaty that precedes the Indian Act and thus excludes them from any commercial rules being imposed and agreed to by the Assembly of First Nations. The Liberal Government of Canada, so far, has only demonstrated an interest in acknowledging and working with the corporate Assembly of First Nations, and has yet to formally recognize the legitimate sovereign claims of the Mohawk Onkweonwe. This is a story that CVN will be looking at in greater detail over the coming months. For now, what is important with this story is to be careful about taking a story merely at its face value. The Assembly of First Nations does not represent all natural peoples of Turtle Island, or more specifically Canada in this case. The group only represents the commercial interests. For those living in the United States, this could very loosely be compared to an omnibus bill of legislation that the U.S. Congress attempts to pass. The legislation may look good at the top, and this is what the politicians vote on, but until one reads all the fine print of the legislation, which can be hundreds of pages long, which people rarely do, they will miss all the backroom dealings and agreements that were made in order to secure the vote of a particular representative for that legislation. This story goes much deeper than merely an apology, or even some kind of settlement, because a settlement involves a commercial agreement, and not an acknowledgement of the inherent right of the numerous Haudenosaunee-Unwe, the natural peoples of Turtle Island, to exist according to natural laws. More will be forthcoming, and all links will be in the show summary for those interested in following this story. Finally, in health news, as we come into the holiday season, there are many pressures facing people on numerous levels. We have been told that it is a season of peace and that it is a time for family, yet we are bombarded with commercial messages attempting to market and sell gifts that are allegedly just right for him or her. One commercial I observed showed a woman joyfully receiving a blender and the man joyfully receiving a hand drill. Although there are some who might truly appreciate gifts such as these, they still represent the old stereotypes that many no longer observe. I imagined numerous wives and girlfriends leaning over to their male partners and whispering, "If you ever give me a gift like that." It is enough to make the man run to his closet and grab the gift and race back to the store to return or exchange it. Meaningful gifts, especially this holiday, perhaps more than any other, will touch the heart in more profound ways. It is my personal feeling and belief that experiences are worth far more than possessions. A toy will be enjoyed for a week and then forgotten. A trip to a new country or even some other meaningful destination and sharing quality time together as a couple or a family will be remembered for a lifetime. Offering a short holiday at a spa for one's significant other is an option worth considering. Creating opportunities for individuals and family to reconnect to love and to energies that embrace the unfolding consciousness instead of contributing to the commercial profits of organizations that have lost the ability to care, in my humble opinion, will be far more meaningful this holiday season. Given the choice between a present or an opportunity to spend quality time with one's parents, most children would lean to spending that time with parents. It is a season of romance, and those who are blessed to be able to share the season with someone special may be challenged to find ways to love that do not involve giving expensive materialistic presents. An article that appeared on the Good Men Project website on December the 11th takes on an issue that seems to affect many men. Steve Horseman writes the following: "Women's jaws would drop if they could listen in on my conversations with married men. Our discussions contradict just about every misconception wives utter about their husbands. Husbands don't want to hurt, they don't want to argue, they don't want to control. And they definitely don't just want sex. These guys are desperate for her to know the truth, and they shed tears at the thought that their wives may never want to know the truth. In today's world, as women are beginning to reclaim the power and respect that they do rightfully deserve, men are often left struggling as to how to provide something that a woman wants or needs in a world where the woman no longer necessarily needs a man, relative to how it was socially accepted in the past. This article suggests that there is something that a woman can give her man that will uplift his spirits, perhaps in more ways than she may realize." Horseman continues, "When a woman calmly grazes the end of her pinky finger across any exposed skin on a man's body and offers a verbal or nonverbal vote of confidence or support, his world changes at that instant. It is so powerful we are often left speechless. Our throats and tear ducts begin to swell and we quietly indulge in the comforting reassurance of the moment. If we could package the word love, it would feel like this when the bottle was opened. Our well-being meter pegs out and our heart rate and breathing slows. Horseman notes that every husband I know is dying to feel this. Simple, easy-peasy, feminine acceptance and approval. Horseman calls it pinky power, the power of the little finger of a woman. Women may ask, why did he not just tell me this? And Horseman explains it's simple. We think women will think it's silly. It's not manly. It's too vulnerable. Women might laugh at the notion that their words and touch could cause a lump in our throats. Even if we try to explain it, they might just roll their eyes along with a big please. The most common reason husbands feel like they can't talk about it is because their wives have already proven they aren't interested or can't handle it. In her brilliant article, I Am the Patriarchy, Jonah Lynn Grace Fincher listed 17 shining examples of how women refuse to let men be vulnerable. The article continued the discussion Brené Brown started in her book, Daring Greatly, where she addresses male vulnerability. Horseman quotes Brené Brown from her book, Daring Greatly, as saying that we ask men to be vulnerable, we beg them to let us in, and we plead with them to tell us when they are afraid, but the truth is that most women can't stomach it. In these moments, when real vulnerability happens in men, most of us recoil with fear, and that fear manifests as everything from disappointment to disgust, and men are very smart. Fincher's article contains a starter kit with at least 15 items for women to consider in wanting to open the door between women and their men on this issue. To be fair to non-heterosexual couples, the same logic would very likely apply, but I am unable to confirm that from my own personal experience. Having information is one thing. Knowing what to do with it or how to apply it is a totally different thing. Horseman concludes with some guidance to both women and men as to how to use this information. For women, he writes, You have more personal influence and power in your relationship than you know. Your ability to inspire feelings of confidence and well-being in your man is available to you at all times, every minute of every day. What might you stop doing today and start doing tomorrow that could change his world in an instant? You have this secret power. Why wouldn't you use it? For men, he offers the following. Admit it. You want Pinky power. You love Pinky power. Her touch of approval and acceptance is a gift you want more than sex. If we're honest, those are the feelings we seek through sex, aren't they? Don't be ashamed of your needs and vulnerability. Stand proud in your manly desire for her Pinky power. Explain it without apology or fear. Find out what her version of Pinky power is from you. Then apply generously. The show summary includes the link to Jonah Lynn Grace Fincher's website and the book by Breen Brown. Fincher explores many topics relating to relationships and sexuality. Also, a link is provided to an article by Marianne Williamson, who writes about the spiritual purpose of relationships. Hopefully, this may help some listeners bring some true quality time back into their personal relationships during this holiday season. Last week in part 1 of a 2-part series on non-physical touch and the non-locality of healing, Jeremy Halpin introduced the concept and the basics. In part 2 this week, Halpin explores taking shiatsu off of the body through work with the solid air body by tapping into source energy.
Where does shiatsu end and non-physical healing techniques begin? The practice of shiatsu may be approached from many levels and employ a vast array of techniques. As we become acquainted with them, some have a more intrinsic and intuitive appeal than others, in accordance with our individual nature and aptitude. It is understandable why non-physical touch in energy work has had such difficulty gaining a foothold in shiatsu. It is not only a question of pressure, but more that the meridians gradually disappear the further one works from the body. As the meridians merge with the etheric fields and dimensions in the solid air body, they become quickly irrelevant, and other more interesting and relevant systems emerge. Here, the energy takes on a more multidimensional form. There are several challenges when working with others in this space. When we leave behind the rules, boundaries, and limitations governing the physical universe, we encounter another etheric playground that at first seems random and shifting. When working in the solid air and letting a treatment unfold to tell its own story, it is possible to access a space that seems almost beyond time. When working like this, it's best to leave fixed ideas and closed systems behind. Remain in the here and now and intuitively respond. The Zen oneness in shiatsu is beyond any system. It is the solid air in free flow, but it is often seen as an almost freak, unexplainable experience, a kind of peak or climax in a treatment instead of the starting point for a new one. Solid air as a treatment form has its roots in what may be called infinite planetary knowledge. This seems to be the same knowledge upon which the indigenous tribes of the ancient world based their traditional medicine. It is a natural healing source. Every one of us shares this knowledge as a kind of pure inner state. This is actually a highly evolved sense that most of us take for granted. When we sit thinking alone, drifting in and out of meditative thought waves, we are able to travel at random with our minds to distant places through countless dimensions. You will naturally experience this state. The next time you are in the countryside, just stand still and sense your surroundings. Only the distractions and demands of the three-dimensional physical world keep us tethered to our common sense of here and now, in space and time. Zen Shiatsu has oneness as a main unifying force. This state of oneness is very similar to when we are drifting in and out of meditative thought waves. The difference here is that we drift together with another person in a unified space. Typical client experiences during a solid air treatment. Disappearing during the treatment with little recollection of time and events. A change in one's perception of their body's physical boundaries, shape, or density. Meeting the therapist. The therapist's appearance, however, may be completely different from how they appear in the physical universe. Possessing powers or ability that seem impossible in the waking state. Flying, breathing underwater, traveling in space, and so on. Interaction with other beings, shapes, architecture, animals, plants, previously unknown technologies, and the like. Spontaneous physical movement, twitching, spasming, breathing changes, heat and cold sensations, specific movements, spontaneous yoga postures relevant to their physical blockage, regardless of previous exposure to these disciplines. Typical therapist experiences in solid air treatment. Finding rifts in the airspace around the client. Feeling or seeing the contours of the client's body differently from their physical one. For example, long hair on a short-haired person, different skull shapes, clothing, costumes, jewelry, etc. Finding objects in or around them such as crystals, musical instruments, wings, plants, flowers, animals, and so on. Seeing the client in symbolic form, such as an animal or geographical landscape. Traveling in time and space. Having the experience of transcending physical laws. For example, journeying inside the patient's body in order to restructure, reorder, clean or harmonize a function. Experience working with different elements like fire, water, earth, and so on. Effects of solid air therapy. The ability to deeply relax for the first time. Improved sleep patterns. Symbolic dreaming and visions. Rapid improvement in their symptoms, even those they neglected to report. Continuation of treatment reactions for several days afterwards. Greater openness and desire to explore the spiritual aspects of their lives. Making the transition from normal shiatsu practice requires an adjustment of the mind. Where traditional concepts like diagnosis, meridians and points needs a centralized focus, access to the solid air requires a more diffuse, dreamlike sense of watchfulness, devoid of expectation or preconceptions. Several factors may determine our ability to access a fluid working experience in this state. Our personal attitude or beliefs about multidimensional states and concurrent realities, our attachment to the security of our current treatment model, the receptivity of our patients and their willingness to confirm emergent experiences in treatment. None of these are absolute limitations, of course, as the process is at work regardless. Once we accept that Zen Shiatsu is not a body therapy, as it is often categorized, but an energy treatment that happens to interface with the body, we can appreciate that the leap to non-physical touch in this energy work is really not that far. One thing we have experienced is that once one leaves the body behind, it's hard to go back.
The audio blog and blog article includes 3 examples for any practitioners of this modality for taking shiatsu off the body. The links to this information will be in the show summary. In this week's final words, I was searching this week for an audio quote I had of President Obama telling the people to start speaking out and asking questions of politicians, because when enough people begin to demand change, the politicians will have to react. There is truth in this, but this can also be a double-edged sword, because the global cabal and its partners are extremely tricky. They have learned how to measure what the people want while still working on finding ways to take advantage of them through other channels or other legislation. You heard earlier in the newscast Ben Swann's report focusing on Republican Senator Ted Cruz and his comments that U.S. interventions have only led to increased conflict, terror, and instability. Swann validated those comments with appropriate statistics. Here's where things get a little tricky. The owners of the media empire that Swann works for no doubt see that people around the world are demanding more truth, and they are cheering when certain truths get exposed. As I have been trying to share with listeners over the last 4 years, this global cabal, and global banking cabal as I call them, have control over so many different industries, organizations, institutions, and governments that all they have to do is switch to another strategy when one begins to fail. The media has been attempting to get the world to think that Daesh, also known as the Islamic State, is full of radical Muslims. Truth be known, this group is not controlled by Muslims, and also, in fact, the actions of this group do not conform to any true Islamic belief. Muslims have been attempting to speak out. As we heard earlier, their protest in London was not covered by the mainstream media. Why? If the world began to realize that Muslims are against the actions of Daesh, it could derail the entire plan for the destabilization of the Middle East. What we are witnessing now, however, is a different form of destabilization of the Middle East. One might argue that it is more of a re-stabilization, and it is coming in the form of Russian support in effectively taking out the Daesh bases, and also taking out the Daesh oil transport convoys heading to Turkey, something that the U.S. forces have allegedly been instructed not to do. I had a discussion with my mother this morning about this. Bless her heart, she always wants to see the best in people. To a degree, she is absolutely correct. This is indeed what we must all strive to do, to find that good that is within all and seek to empower that. What I tried to share with her, however, is that in dealing with governing entities, a different approach is necessary. Politicians and governing entities may make certain promises that sound really great when the promises are made, but when it comes to putting those promises into action, one has to be very careful that what looks good on the surface does not become corrupted further down when reading the fine print. It is one thing to want to believe that a certain leader will truly be a good leader based only on the promises that one makes. As always, it comes down to whether or not a leader truly stands by one's words, because words, like statistics, can be manipulated in tricky ways. The language of the legal system is designed to do exactly that, and lawyers are great manipulators of words within the environment of commercial law in seeking to suppress the rights of individuals while claiming to be fighting to preserve those same rights. While it is honorable to want to believe that politicians will be truly good based on their words, history has demonstrated that this is simply not the case. While an individual may have an honorable intent when she or he first becomes a politician, there is still a very corrupt structure that one has to deal with, and this leads to compromises and sacrifices that one may not have originally intended. Therefore, it is perhaps wise to avoid giving politicians the free hand to serve with the belief that they will do well. Rather, and I do say this unfortunately because it should not be this way, we have to remain critically skeptical of politicians and indeed of all people in positions of influence and leadership, and I include myself in this. We have to let them know that we are not just blindly accepting their word, and that the people are indeed monitoring their words and actions. Through deeper investigation, people are beginning to connect the dots of whether one's actions, although seemingly honorable on the surface, are they truly honorable at the end of the day. Making claims of bombing Daesh while ignoring the oil convoys that provide the funding to the same group is not exactly honorable. Making claims and apologies to honor Indigenous people while ignoring the truths of the financial system and the system of commercial law that keeps people enslaved is not exactly honorable. In the case of Ted Cruz making statements about the U.S. government being complicit in participating in terror, although great on the surface, may lead to a leadership that is willing to make sacrifices and compromises on numerous other topics and issues which further erode the rights of all citizens. This is why it is so important to corner politicians on revealing their full policy, as opposed to blindly supporting them because they happen to speak the truth on one or two issues. We have begun moving through a period of intense change on many very profound levels, and very likely also on levels which we are not yet familiar. Much is being exposed, and the global cabal knows this. They are beginning to realize that their gig is up, and they are desperately trying to find ways to capitalize on the push by the people for greater truth. If they can win people over on one issue of truth while getting them to ignore, disregard, or even forget all that they are doing which is opposite to that truth, then the people are still sheep, because they have not done their homework and will continue to be victimized without holding the appropriate people accountable. However you choose to observe this holiday season, may you find the time to peacefully observe all that is unfolding and try your very best to anchor the energies of positive change, envisioning only that which you choose to see in the new world that is birthing, as opposed to only observing the fading away of all that no longer serves the highest good of humanity or our planet. Perhaps we'll be together next week. Create a wonderful week until our next Moment of Now. So that is a sample of the unfolding higher consciousness news around the world this week. Cosmic Vision News is broadcast weekly from the Cosmic Vision News website. Links to stories used in this broadcast are published in the show summary, which is also on the website. CVN can be followed through the Facebook page, Scene page, and YouTube channel, as well as Twitter, Google+, and LinkedIn. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I'm Jeffrey West, reminding you that people don't need to be saved or rescued. People need knowledge of their own power and how to access it. Until our next Moment of Now, stay grounded in love, hold the vision of light and peace in your hearts, keep your eyes to the skies, disclosure is unfolding all around you. Namaste.